On the morning of June 6, 1944, American soldiers stepped into the surf at Omaha Beach, knowing some of them would not step back out. Reese walked the ridge alone the first week, boots cutting shallow prints in thawing mud. The others watched him from below, trading jokes about his science project. They saw the crates of empty ration tins, the coils of surplus wire, the little stakes hammered into the slope, and it confirmed what they already believed about him. Too quiet, too careful, the sort of officer who wrote more than he shouted. He started with a single can. He wired it to a peg on the windward side of the slope, and stood 5 paces back. The breeze pushed through the hollow metal with a faint, irregular whine. He listened, head tilted, then moved the peg 2 inches downslope. The sound changed pitch, barely, but enough for him to mark the difference on a small, mud-stained notebook. His handwriting was cramped and economical, rows of numbers compressed beside short lines of description. Ridge lip. 3 degrees south, soil saturation high, echo return, dull. The others assumed he was building an alarm line. They had seen it before, cans on wires that rattled when someone tripped a cord, crude perimeter warnings that belonged more to farm fields than to war. A corporal leaned on his rifle and told the others that the lieutenant was turning the hill into a junkyard wind chime. The phrase stuck. Whenever Reese headed up slope with another bundle of wire, they asked him how the music was coming. He ignored them. His interest was not in sound as noise, but in sound as measurement. As daylight shifted across the ridge, he tracked how the hollow metal responded. Early mornings brought a clear, thin tone. Afternoons, when the ground had warmed and softened, produced a flatter, slower vibration. On windless days the cans hung still, yet when a squad moved along the valley road below, they trembled almost imperceptibly. The vibrations came not from the men themselves, but from the micro-shifts in soil and air their movement created. The landscape registered their passing before any eye could. Reese spaced more cans along the ridgeline, never in a neat pattern. He placed them where the rock face changed texture, where the soil darkened with hidden moisture, where meltwater from the last snow had carved shallow channels. Each new can became another point of reference, another node in a crude but precise network that returns information instead of guarding it. From the command post, Colonel Mason watched the installation take shape with mild irritation. "He's stringing garbage up there," the colonel said to his operations officer. "Tell him this isn't an art project." The operations officer delivered the message that afternoon, standing at the edge of the ridge, while Reese tightened a length of wire between 2 pegs. Reese nodded, as if he had heard something inevitable. He said nothing defensive, nothing argumentative. He simply replied that the materials were already on the supply rolls, empty tins, scrap wire, common stakes, and that they were costing the battalion nothing but patience. "Is it an alarm line or not?" the operations officer asked. Reese shook his head. "It's a map," he said. "Just a different kind." The officer went back down, unconvinced. He wrote in his log that the lieutenant was experimenting with acoustic observation methods, a phrase vague enough to be harmless. No one above him read it twice. Reese kept walking. He learned the ridge by increments. He tapped his boot heel against exposed stone and listened for a hollow note. He pressed his palm into the mud to feel how quickly water seeped around his fingers. When it rained, he stood under his poncho near the cans and counted how long it took for their tone to change as the ground absorbed the weight of new water. Each tiny shift went into the notebook, a growing ledger of the ridge's secret life. From below, the men saw none of that. They saw the lieutenant crouched beside cans and wires, the faint metallic tremor rising and falling around him. They mocked the ritual, because confusion is easier to bear when wrapped in ridicule. One sergeant said that if the enemy came at night, they would at least have something to listen to while they died. Laughter traveled up the slope like a second wind. Reese knew they didn't understand. He also knew that understanding was not required, not yet. The ridge was talking, and he was the only one listening. The cans were not alarms. They were instruments, tuned not to warn, but to measure. In their thin metal shells, the ridge's hidden mechanics were becoming legible. He had not set a single explosive. He had driven no charges into stone. The tripwires he strung along the upper lip of the slope were slack, almost lazy, tension set far below what any manual would recommend for demolition work. If an engineer officer had come by, he would have found nothing resembling standard practice. Reese did not intend to blast anything apart. He meant to find the point where the ridge would decide to move on its own. The first real pattern emerged in the mud. A week after the cans went up, the enemy began sending small patrols into the valley, 12 men at a time, then 14, moving in loose formation along the road that cut beneath the ridge. They stayed close to the slope, using the rock as partial cover, boots sinking into the thawed earth. Twice Reese watched them through binoculars from a fold in the ground above, his profile lost against the dim sky. He barely looked at their faces. He looked at their feet. At first the prints were shallow, evenly spaced, the marks of fresh legs and cautious discipline. The next day, the same unit, or one outfitted like it, passed again, but the prints bit deeper. The weight distribution had changed. Packs were heavier, or fatigue had arranged bones and muscles into a new geometry. In the afternoon, when the patrol returned, the impression shifted once more, heels dragging slightly, strides shortened by half a boot length, arcs of splashed mud curving outward where balance had failed for a split second. Reese walked the track after they passed, tracing the sequence with the tip of his boot. He marked the depth of each print with a thin stick, cutting notches to measure relative weight. He noted where the mud crust had sheared and where it had held, how long it took for seepage to refill the deeper pits. The road became a slow-motion film of the patrol's exhaustion. He paired these observations with the cans. When the patrol moved under the ridge, the cans trembled in response to the ground's subtle rearrangement. The vibrations traveled through soil and stone before they reached the wire. Early patrols sent sharp, distinct shivers through the metal, short pulses with clean decay. Later trips, when men were tired and packs rode low, produced slower, heavier reverberations. Reese sat in a shallow scrape just below the crest, eyes closed, counting the intervals between pulses, matching them to the footprint measurements he had taken earlier. By the end of 3 days, he could tell, from sound alone, how many men were below, how they were carrying their weight, and roughly how far along their march they were. He began to sketch a schedule. Rain came on the 4th day, a slow, soaking front that turned the road into a dark ribbon of churned earth. The patrols did not stop. They could not. Supply lines and reconnaissance did not obey the weather. They moved slower now, feet sliding in the mud, each step compressing water into expanding hollows. The ridge felt every motion. The cans did too. The tones dropped. What had been light, tinny vibration became something heavier, like a breath sinking lower into the chest. Reese recorded the change, linking it to saturation levels in the soil. He tested the mud himself, pressing a boot into the shoulder of the slope and watching how long it took for the print to lose its edges. The deeper the imprint, the faster its collapse. The ridge was softening from within. Only then did he begin to adjust the tripwires. He ran narrow-gauge wire higher along the slope, close to the line where brush gave way to bare rock. He anchored it around stones that, to any casual observer, looked secure. In his notebook, those stones had other names: floaters, delaminated plates, rock faces resting on seams of compacted soil and ice rather than fused to the mountain's core. Meltwater from the last winter had opened invisible gaps beneath them. A sharp enough pull at the right angle would not tear the wire but shift the stone just enough to let gravity finish the job. He did not need explosives. He needed timing. Reese mapped the predicted collapse line, marking it with small scratches on his own stakes, not on any formal chart. When a section of ridge gave way, it would not be a single dramatic avalanche, but a controlled slide of earth and debris, enough to sweep feet out from under a unit pinned against the slope. They would slip into the fall, not beneath it, their formation broken and compressed into pre-sighted kill zones along the valley floor. He sighted those zones next. Crossfire, in manuals, depended on sight lines and overlapping arcs of fire, drawn on neat diagrams. Reese used echoes. He fired single, blank rounds into the valley and listened to the returns, counting how long it took for sound to bounce back from opposite walls, how it split around small outcroppings, how it deadened where the slope bulged. He placed his firing positions not where the view was best, but where the sound came back strongest. The men assigned to those positions found them odd. Shallow scrapes in places where the ridge seemed to offer little cover and no commanding view. When they raised concerns, he listened carefully, then asked them to sit in silence for a minute while he walked below and stamped his boots in the valley. The echoes told the story. After a few demonstrations, most of them stopped complaining. There was something uncanny about hearing a man's footsteps multiplied and sharpened by rock in exactly the direction their rifles would be pointing. Word of his methods filtered sideways through the battalion. 2 engineers walked the ridge with him one afternoon, sent by regimental staff to determine whether he was violating any ordinance. They inspected the wires, tested their tension, kicked at a few of the suspect stones. One of them crouched by a can, flicked it with his fingernail, and smirked. "It's not even tight enough to trigger a blasting cap," he said. "It's not for blasting caps," Reese replied. "What is it for, then?" "Timing," he said, "and direction." They asked him about safety distances, about charge weights, about soil displacement formulas they remembered from school. He answered honestly. No charges, no calculated craters, no blast radii, only the ridge's own stored fatigue, and a way to invite it to release at a useful moment. The explanation made them uneasy. It did not fit under any of the headings they knew: demolitions, obstacle creation, field fortification. One of them wrote a short, wary note for higher headquarters, recommending that Reese's non-standard terrain manipulation be reviewed before broader adoption. The review came back quickly, denied. Not because the method was unsafe or ineffective, no one had seen it in action yet, but because it lacked procedural shape. There were no standardized tables, no training modules, no supply codes attached to tin cans and scrap wire as anything but trash. Command preferred methods that could be taught in classrooms, that came with diagrams and fill-in-the-blank forms that could be audited later. On paper, Reese's experiment remained a curiosity. On the ridge, it continued to evolve. Where official channels had closed, the informal ones opened. Squad leaders asked to see his notebooks. Scouts copied his simple footprint depth scale and began applying it on their own patrols. A sergeant in a neighboring company requested a bundle of empty tins and strung his own makeshift line in a narrow defile, just to hear how the canyon walls answered. Field units were adopting Reese's model without waiting for doctrine. They did not call it geophysics or acoustic calibration. They just called it the can trick, and trusted that the man who had spent more hours listening to the ridge than anyone else might have heard something worth using. The enemy patrol came at dawn, 14 men moving with the slow assurance of soldiers who believed they understood the ground beneath them. They had passed this way before. Twice in the last week, their boots had cut the same path along the valley shoulder, rifles angled toward the opposite slope, eyes searching for the bright edges of gun barrels or the flash of glass. They expected danger to reveal itself in human shapes and mechanical silhouettes, not in the way the earth held its breath. In the dim light, their outlines blended into a single, dark thread against the road. Packs rode low on tired shoulders. The rain from the previous night had soaked their uniforms. Steam rose faintly from their backs as the morning air met damp cloth. Their steps fell into a practiced cadence, not too fast, not too slow, the rhythm of men who had been told that schedule mattered more than comfort. Up on the ridge, Lieutenant Reese lay in his shallow scrape, cheek pressed to cold soil, eye level with the base of a scrub bush. The cans behind him murmured softly, a faint, irregular quiver along the wire line. He checked his watch, not for the time of day, but for the intervals he had marked in his notes. The patrol was 4 minutes ahead of the schedule he had predicted, less fatigue than the last pass, perhaps, or lighter loads. It didn't matter. The slope did not answer the clock. It answered weight. He signaled to the 2 rifle teams in their concealed positions downrange, a small, flat-handed gesture they had practiced until it needed no interpretation. Stand by. The first real cue came not from sight or sound, but from touch. The ground beneath his forearm vibrated, a low, slow hum that traveled through bone. The cans picked it up half a second later, metal shells trembling in sequence, the wire line drawing a narrow arc in the air. Reese watched the exact point, where 3 wires met at a single, higher peg near the ridge lip. The intersection jittered, then settled, then jittered again with a slightly different amplitude. The patrol had reached the critical sector. Reese exhaled and placed his hand on the main tripwire. It was not a dramatic motion. He did not yank or jerk. He increased tension by a fraction, just enough to overcome the minute structural resistance he had mapped weeks before. Somewhere beneath the surface, a flake of stone completed its slow argument with gravity and slipped onto the soft, water-laced soil below. The slope felt the decision and passed it along. From below, the first indication the patrol received was a subtle loosening underfoot, as if the road had gone from firm to oddly fluid. The point man glanced down, frowning at the way his boot sank farther than expected. He had time to open his mouth, to begin a warning that never formed into words. The ridge moved. It did not explode or roar. It sighed. A section of the upper slope slumped forward as a single heavy body, stones and soil and scrub, sliding together in a slow, unstoppable sheet. The lead 4 men dropped as the ground vanished beneath them, legs swept sideways by a wave of earth. Those behind tried to step back, but their boots found only shifting mud, momentum pulling them into the collapse. From Reese's position it looked almost peaceful. 14 figures tilted, staggered, and disappeared into a rolling curtain of dirt and rock that pushed them toward the valley center line in a low, grinding flow. The cans went briefly silent, wires slackening as anchoring stones shifted, then began to vibrate wildly as new tension rippled through the line. He counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The ridge surface rearranged itself, dust lifting in a thin cloud that caught the weak sunlight. Some of the patrol tried to climb, but the slope they reached for was no longer there. Their hands clawed loose soil that slid away like wet sand. They were carried downslope on their backs and knees, rifles spinning out of reach. 4, 5, 6. At the 6-second mark, the first man came to rest in the kill zone Reese had plotted with his echo tests. His body lay partly exposed, lower half buried, upper half twisting toward cover that no longer existed. More followed, a tangle of limbs and gear compressed into a narrow strip of ground where the slide had lost momentum. 7. Reese raised his hand and held it there. 8. He dropped it. The crossfire opened from 2 sides simultaneously, rifles bucking in the shallow scrapes he had sighted days before. There was no frantic correction, no search for targets. The men in those positions fired at fixed points, letting the geometry of the valley do the work. Bullets crossed and recrossed the compressed space where the patrol lay, moving through dust and motion with clinical certainty. 9, 10, 11. By the time he reached 11, the firing had already begun to taper. A few of the enemy still moved, dragging themselves toward any depression that looked like shelter. But the slide had left them nowhere to disappear. The same ridgeline that had collapsed to deliver them into the open now offered no new cover. Silence returned in layers. First the rifles, then the cans, settling into a new configuration over a subtly altered slope. The dust hung in the air for a long moment, then thinned, revealing the valley floor as a rough, newly drawn map of bodies and debris. From above it looked like a diagram he had once sketched in a notebook, only sharper, more final. The entire sequence from the first shift under the lead man's boot to the last shot fired had taken 11 seconds. The spotter beside him swallowed hard, the sound loud in the quiet. "Sir," he said, voice low. "That was—" He didn't finish the sentence. There was no word in the manuals for what they had just done. It was not an ambush in the traditional sense, not a minefield, not a barrage. It was the ridge, answering a question that only one man had thought to ask. Reese closed his notebook over the short, final line he had drawn that morning. Patrol 14, saturation high, predicted intersection window, plus 15 seconds. He did not smile. There was nothing triumphant in his face, only a kind of weary confirmation. "It worked," the spotter said. "It obeyed," Reese replied. He didn't say who or what he meant. The slope, the cans, the timing, gravity itself. In that moment, they were all the same system. News of the 11 seconds moved faster than any official report. That afternoon, before the bodies had even been fully recovered from the churn strip of valley, rumors began to spread through the companies along the line. Men who had seen the slide from a distance described it as an avalanche, timed to a watch. Others said the ridge had simply given up and let go when Reese touched the wire. A few claimed, half joking, that he had somehow talked the mountain into doing the work for them. By evening, squad leaders from 3 different units had come up to the ridge to see what remained of his installation. They found the cans crooked, some half-buried, wires sagging where anchoring stones had tumbled. The tripwires that had once looked slack and meaningless now had a lineage. They traced the path of the slide, with their eyes and boots following the shallow scar across the slope to the valley floor, where medics and stretcher teams still moved among the fallen. "Can you show us how you knew?" one of them asked. Reese did not show them everything. He did not have the time, and the language for what he had done did not fit easily into the words they expected from an officer. He pointed out the float stones, the way water had undercut them, the scale marks in his notebook that linked soil saturation to collapse readiness. He let them handle a can, tapping it lightly to produce the thin, telling ring. "It's not about the noise," he said. "It's about the change in the noise." They nodded as if they understood, some genuinely trying, others already translating his explanation into something simpler in their minds. By the time they returned to their own positions, his detailed acoustic and geotechnical language had been boiled down to a few phrases. He reads the mud, he listens to the cans, he can tell when the hill's ready to go. In the command post, the tone was different. Colonel Mason sat behind a folding table, the report pinned under his hand. The engineer's earlier recommendation for review lay beside it, the word "denied" stamped across the top in faint red. The fresh account, written by an adjutant who had not seen the ridge but had heard enough to be unsettled, described the event in careful, flattened prose. Enemy patrol neutralized due to terrain collapse event, coinciding with pre-sighted crossfire. The colonel read it twice, frowning more with each pass. He did not like variables he could not chart, methods he could not package into a standard operating procedure. He called Reese into the tent. The lieutenant stood at attention while Mason asked his questions. What materials had he used? What formal training did he have in demolitions? How had he ensured that the slope collapse would not endanger his own men? Reese answered in the same calm, precise tone he used on the ridge, describing soil fatigue, echo-based timing, margin of error calculations. He mentioned that the crossfire positions had been sighted based on acoustic mapping, rather than pure line of sight. "You're telling me you caused that slide without a single explosive charge," Mason said. "Yes, sir." "Using ration cans and scrap wire." "Yes, sir." Mason stared at him for a long moment. "Do you realize what kind of liability this creates? If that slope had gone early, we could have lost our own people. There's no technical manual for what you've done, no safety review." Reese did not argue. There was no point. From the colonel's perspective, anything that could not be written into a field manual and inspected was indistinguishable from recklessness, no matter how carefully it had been prepared. "I want all non-standard wiring removed from the ridge by tomorrow," Mason said finally. "If engineers can't sign off on it, it doesn't belong in my sector. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," Reese said. He left the tent, stepped into the fading light, and walked back toward the ridge. On the way up, he passed two sergeants quietly loading a crate with empty tins from the mess area. They nodded to him, faces blank, and continued on without breaking stride. They did not need official endorsement. The can trick had already seeded itself. The next day, per the colonel's order, the visible wires on the ridge were reduced, the most obvious pegs pulled, the line simplified. Reese complied in the only way that made sense to him. He removed what command could see and left in place what only the ridge would notice. A few cans remained, hung lower, closer to the ground, where their vibrations would not draw the eye, but would still carry information through wire and soil. Down in the company areas, improvised lines began to appear along drainage ditches and shallow cuts. No one called them Reese systems. They were simply useful. Scouts set one or two tins near their observation posts and learned, by trial and error, how the pitch changed as the ground around them shifted. An engineer with a practical bent started a notebook of his own, scribbling down crude correlations between rainfall and soil if underfoot. Formal channels, meanwhile, held the line. The regimental staff discussed the incident in guarded terms, worrying over legal exposure and doctrinal precedent. A draft memo circulated, proposing that environmentally induced terrain collapses be classified under a vague heading and subject to prior engineering approval. It stalled before signature. No one wanted to be the first to authorize a method they didn't fully grasp, especially one that relied on conditions no one could promise to replicate exactly. In the end, the event was filed as a fortunate accident, aided by the initiative of junior officers. Reese's name appeared once in a list of commendations recommended but delayed pending further review. The review never came. He did not chase it. He spent his evenings the same way he had before, hunched over his notebook, refining his observations. After the slide, he paid closer attention to how long it took the ridge to settle into its new configuration, how the can's vibration signatures changed over the following days. It was clear to him now that the 11 seconds had not been a miracle or a risk. They had been the natural culmination of a process he had simply learned to read. The ridge no longer held the same tension it had before. It had exhaled once, heavily. To demand the same performance again without similar preparation would be foolish. He wrote as much in his notes, underlining a single phrase, no repetition without reloaded stress. Gravity had its own logistics. Across the sector, his quiet influence persisted in small, unrecorded acts. A squad leader in another company used footprint depth to justify slowing his patrol's pace before a climb, preventing exhaustion that might have left his men exposed. A machine gunner adjusted his firing lane after noticing that echoes returned strangely from a certain cut, discovering a hidden washout that could have concealed an enemy approach. A young lieutenant in the engineer's platoon, curious despite official discomfort, began placing cans along a riverbank to see how rising water changed the tone. None of these men ever filed formal reports on what they were doing. To them, it was just fieldcraft, another layer of intuition on top of training. They would have done it anyway, they told themselves. The ridge had merely reminded them to watch and listen. Official history would not mention tin tripwires or 11-second landslides. It would speak of patrol interdictions, advantageous terrain, disciplined fire. It would divide the battle into understandable pieces, each with a name, each with a doctrinal box around it. The strange intersection of gravity, sound, and human patience that had erased a 14-man patrol in a handful of heartbeats would be compressed into a line item. On the ridge, the cans still hung. Fewer, now, but enough. Sometimes when the wind shifted just right and the ground had soaked up a week's worth of minor movements, they trembled with a faint, almost inaudible rhythm. Reese would pause his walk, tilt his head, and listen. The war, in those moments, was not noise and blast and visible power. It was a system calibrating itself, indifferent to rank and doctrine. He remained, as ever, a quiet man on a slope with a notebook, measuring the difference between what men thought the ground would do and what it was already preparing to do on its own. If these names and their quiet sacrifice stayed with you, then passing this story on can be your way of honoring them. Together we have looked not only at history, but at the weight carried by those who never came home. So here's the question that remains. If you had stepped into that cold gray surf on Omaha that morning, what single thought would you have held on to? And why?